We're joined now out of Melbourne by the Shadow Climate Change Minister, Greg Hunt. Mr Hunt, thanks for your company.
Good morning, Peter.
Let me just go straight to the direct action policy. We'll talk no doubt about the carbon tax, which isn't on the agenda for the tax forum this coming week. But the direct action policy of yours has been criticised by economists in this country. There's been suggestions that you can't make it happen vis-a-vis the amount of money you're putting into it. How do you respond to that?
Well, our view is very clear that we can take steps. We can do all that we pledged to do, and we do it very simply by focusing on the solution, not by focusing on an enormous new tax which increases the operating costs of the economy as a whole. The way we do that is we do practical things such as cleaning up waste coal mine gas, cleaning up landfill gas, capturing carbon in soil and trees, and cleaning up rather than closing down our dirtiest power stations. Real and practical things. And if you focus on the solution, not on increasing the operating costs of the economy essentially through an electricity tax, it is very possible to achieve the outcomes, and we will achieve the outcomes.
What about the fact, though, that there aren't economists in this country that seem to think that direct action is the best and most efficient way to go?
Well, let me just look at what the government itself has done in relation to direct action. The carbon tax is making no impact on Australian emissions. Under the carbon tax, emissions will go up by 43 million tonnes at a cost of $105 billion of tax between now and 2020. What we're doing is focusing directly on reducing emissions. Interestingly, the government itself, having denounced and derided that approach, realises that the carbon tax won't decrease electricity emissions, and it has gone directly to a means of direct action for reducing emissions by providing incentives to the power stations. Exactly what we're proposing, exactly what they've derided, yet in the end their only mechanism for cleaning up the power stations is our own direct action approach.
Mr Hunt, how confident are you that a coalition government could in fact repeal the carbon pricing scheme, given the property rights invested in it and given that you won't control the Senate?
Well, the government has raised this point as a threat effectively to say to the people that we didn't give you a say at the last election and we don't want you to have a say at the next election. It's an act of almost breathtaking democratic arrogance. In practice, it is not difficult to repeal the legislation because, firstly, we believe that if we were to win the election and the ALP were therefore to lose, they would not stand in the way of repeal. We don't expect the Greens to change their position. We do think that in opposition, the ALP would be forced to recognise the mandate of repeal. And if they did not, we will take this to a double dissolution. In terms of property rights, the government is only talking about half the equation. If they say, you owe us $100 and we'll give you a right to redeem $66, if you cancel the $66, you're also cancelling the $100 liability. In other words, for every right, there's a commensurate liability. Both of them would go, and no business would be worse off. In fact, all businesses would be better off as a consequence.
I'd just like to ask you, though, just how tenable is that sort of strategy? I mean, the idea of two elections on this issue, going to a second election, a second double dissolution election, I mean, this is a very high-risk strategy, surely.
With respect, I don't believe that's the case. The reason why is we have a very clear position going into the next election, and that is we're building a contract with Middle Australia to protect and preserve their living standards as opposed to a government which wants to increase their electricity prices. We will take that to the people, and we believe that there is overwhelming support to repeal this tax. It is hard to imagine an ALP in opposition actually standing in the way of what may be an overwhelming mandate. I do not believe that they will stand in the way of repealing the carbon tax. Obviously, I don't expect them to concede that before an election. That's the real world. But even if they were to, then we would take it to a double dissolution. So we have a first step and a second step. I believe that we would be successful at the first step, and if not, then there's a very clear fallback.
Good morning, Mr Hunt. I wanted to take you back a couple of years, a couple of decades actually. In 1990 you won the University Medal for your thesis entitled "A Tax to Make the Polluter Pay." Intellectually, that's a great leap forward to where you are at the moment on direct action. How do you explain that?
Well, my work for 2 decades now has been on economic instruments to reduce pollution. And there are good and bad instruments. You have Nobel economic laureates such as Thomas Schelling, Finn Kydland, Vernon Smith, all of whom who've said that in terms of reducing carbon emissions, where you are essentially trying to clean up the electricity sector, driving up the price of electricity is not the effective means of doing it. So you can have effective areas where you might use pricing. Some of that, for example, has been in the sulphur dioxide markets across the United States and Europe. And then you can use the same type of economic instrument, and it can be radically ineffective if it's about driving up the price of electricity. That's why we've got a buyback system, an economic instrument to clean up our electricity sector, to clean up waste coal mine gas, and it is the principle of an economic instrument. But instead of taxing the entire economy, you're simply focusing on the solution to the problem.
Mr Hunt, you mentioned a couple of Nobel laureates there that support the concept of direct action, but I assume what you're referring to there is that report that they supported as the second most effective out of 15 ways of addressing climate change. It was a report by Galliana and Green. But that report by Galliana and Green, whilst it put a significant amount of money into R&D around direct action style policies, it did so with a carbon tax. It put a $5 a tonne carbon tax on, which would go up over the course of a decade, doubling significantly, and then on top of that. So in a sense, that's an endorsement not just perhaps of direct action as one method, but certainly of the concept of a carbon tax, isn't it?
Well, with great respect, in terms of the work of Smith and Kydland and the others involved in the Copenhagen Consensus, they looked at 15 different mechanisms, and 3 of them were variations of the carbon tax. The carbon tax was rated 13, 14 and 15 in terms of the effectiveness. In other words, it was the 3 worst outcomes that the Nobel economic laureates found amongst all of the different mechanisms.
But if I could just jump in on that,
that was a pretty clear international approach.
But if I could just jump in on that, the one that you're talking about that they endorsed, which was like direct action, that was the Galliana and Green one that was rated second out of the 15. But that did include a carbon tax, didn't it?
Well, I think you'll find that the overwhelming view here is that targeting direct solutions and using economic instruments is the way to go. Now, we are not going to raise an additional tax on the Australian people. That is our pledge, that is our contract with Middle Australia.
Well, your contract with Middle Australia, Mr Hunt, would also mean that you would have to take back money that has been paid as compensation to households. How are you planning to do that, and what problems do you see in doing so?
Well, we've been very upfront that we would repeal both the carbon tax and any associated measures. There's no pretence about that, but we would also put in place tax arrangements and conditions for both pensioners and seniors, for people across the spectrum in Australia, which would mean that people will be better off without a carbon tax and without the enormous increases in electricity and gas and groceries. So that's our task. But if you remove the carbon tax, you certainly don't need the associated measures. But we will ensure, and this is a guarantee and a pledge that we have made, that Australians will be better off without a carbon tax.
Well, you said, you'll ensure that there'll be arrangements to benefit pensioners and other low-income households, presumably. I don't understand what that means. Are you still taking money away from them, aren't you?
The net effect of what we're doing is that people will be better off under us.
Well, are you going to spell this out? I mean, this sounds terrific, but